All right, today we're going to be reading pages 26 through 47, and this one part is called The Giant in the Cave. They awoke to a beautiful clear dawn and a fine view. Their ships had run aground in a natural harbor, safely away from the wild open sea. Behind the harbor was a stretch of rich grassland with luxuriant woods beyond. The place seemed to have everything they needed. Huge bunches of grapes grew on wild vines, and a spring of fresh water ran down into the harbor. Looking up at the wooded hills, Odysseus saw a herd of wild goats leaping from rock to rock. The gods must have brought us here, he said. He and his men took their bows and their spears, and they went off to hunt the goats. In a very short time, they had enough meat to last for days, and they discovered that the island was uninhabited. At last, it was safe to rest and relax. They feasted on roasted meat, they washed down with wine, and they looted from the Cicones. I've looked it up. I don't know how to pronounce it, but we're going to say it one of those ways. Afterward, they lay on the beach, gazing across to the mainland. They heard the sound of voices drifting over the water and the bleating of sheep and goats. Oh, it's so nice. That must be Odysseus, maybe, I think. Yeah, very handsome. And they saw smoke rising into the evening sky from the fires like theirs. Idly, as the sun went down, they wondered what kind of people lived over there. They peered across the dark shore, but no human figures were visible. And however hard they tried, they couldn't make out what the voices were saying. Still listening, the sailors fell asleep one by one beside the embers of the fires. Only Odysseus stayed awake, looking across the water. As the sky grew black and the stars came out, he stared at the glimmering light of the distant fires. What was over there? Whose voices could they hear? As soon as the sun rose, Odysseus was on his feet, giving orders to the men as they awoke. 11 ships must stay here to take on food and fresh water, he said, but I'll take my own ship over to the mainland and see what sort of people live there. He signaled to his crew, and they followed him into the water, clambering on board the ships. They took up their oars. It wasn't worth raising the sail, so they rowed the short distance to the opposite shore. Because they were rowing, they were facing backwards. It was only when they turned the ship ready to anchor that they had their first look at the place where they were going to land. It was a strange and unsettling sight. A little way back from the shore, they saw the entrance to a vast cave, shadowed by laurel bushes. In front of the cave was a huge sheep pen made of great blocks of rough-cut stone. Every block was taller than a man. What kind of creature could build like that? The sailors glanced nervously at one another, and someone muttered that they ought to row straight back to the island, but Odysseus was curious, and he bit his lip thoughtfully, making a plan. Most of you must stay and guard the ship, he said. I'll take 12 men with me to explore the cave. He chose 12 of the best and bravest and ordered them to pack up some food. Then he filled the wineskin with rich, strong wine and jumped into the water to wade ashore. He and his 12 companions crept up to the beach toward the towering sheep pen. Peering through a crack in the wall, they saw that it was full of lambs, but there were no adult sheep. Odysseus guessed that the main flock was up in the high pastures with the shepherd, whoever he was, whatever he was. That gave them a chance to explore the cave. Odysseus crept cautiously up to the entrance, beckoning his men to follow. Oh, wow. Oh, yes. Look how little he looks next to those things. What's that all about? When their eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, they saw an amazing sight. The cave was very high and deep, and it was full of gigantic baskets and bowls, and the baskets were filled with cheeses the size of cartwheels, and the bowls were brimming with milk and whey. Look at all this food, cried one of the sailors. There are enough cheeses and lambs to last us all the way back to Ithaca. We don't need to come as looters, Odysseus said. I've brought gifts for the owner of this cave. He'll give us gifts in return out of politeness, and then we'll have all the meat and cheese we need, and we'll have made a new friend, not an enemy. His men were still nervous, but he persuaded them to stay. Taking dry wood from the stack in the back of the cave, they built themselves a fire and settled down to wait for the owner to return. They heard him before they saw him. Thud, thud, thud. His footsteps shook the ground ahead of him. In 3 strides, he had reached the cave and was driving his sheep inside. A huge bundle of firewood flew in after them. And then came the giant himself. His massive body blocked out the light as he stooped to walk through the entrance. Oh, look at them. They look a little concerned. And there's that same page. Not sure why, but that's okay. Oh my, look at that. When Odysseus and his men saw the vast dark shape, they rushed to the back of the cave to hide in the shadows. By the time they turned around to take another look, the monster was blocking the entrance of the cave with a great slab of stone. They were trapped. Shivering in their corner, they watched him sniff at the dying embers of their fire. His massive head turned left and right, peering around, and then he heaped some more wood into the fire. The flames shot up, and they saw his face for the first time. It was broad and ugly, with a jutting nose and a thick, heavy jaw. In the center of his forehead was a single, hideous eye, his only one. They were trapped in the cave of the Cyclops. Oh my, look at him. He's pretty scary. They don't look happy. Oh no. The monster milked his sheep, guzzling down the first bucketful in a single gulp, and he set the rest of the milk aside to curdle for making cheese, and then he built up the fire again, piling the wood so high that the red glare lit up the cave. This time he looked around more carefully, searching for intruders, and when he saw Odysseus and his men, he bellowed, "Sheep stealers!" "We're not thieves," Odysseus said, stepping forward boldly. "We're Greek soldiers sailing home from the war in Troy." The Cyclops peered suspiciously at him. "Sailing? Where's your ship then?" Odysseus certainly wasn't going to tell him that. He made a sad face and gazed up at the giant. "Our ship was wrecked," he said. "Poseidon, the earth shaker, whipped up a great storm and swamped it, and we are the only men who didn't drown. Please give us food and shelter." The Cyclops laughed scornfully. Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, cramming them in his mouth. He gulped them down, grinning as the other sailors shouted in horror. Then he guzzled another bucketful of milk and sprawled on the floor, falling asleep immediately. His body was like a mountain, filling half of the cave. As soon as he began to snore, Odysseus darted forward to draw his sword. "I can climb up his arm," he thought, "and stab him while he's asleep." And the sword was halfway out of his scabbard before he realized how stupid he would be to use it. If he killed the Cyclops, who would let them out of the cave? He and all of his men working together would never be able to move the stone that blocked the entrance. Only the Cyclops was strong enough for that, and without him, they would be trapped in the cave forever, doomed to a slow death by starvation. They had to escape, and if they didn't, the Cyclops would eat them all. But they couldn't get out of the cave without his help. How could they trick him into doing that? All night, Odysseus lay awake and thought, working out one plan, awake in thought. He'd work out one plan and then another, and by morning he knew what he was going to do, but it would not be easy. The Cyclops had no intention of setting them free, and when he awoke, he snatched 2 more of the men and ate them for his breakfast. Then he rolled the stone away and drove his sheep out of the cave, but he kept a constant watch on Odysseus and his companions to stop them from sneaking out with the sheep. As soon as the whole flock was outside, he followed. Grinning cruelly, he pushed the stone back into place. Odysseus waited until the thunderous footsteps had died away in the distance, and he took a long pole that was leaning against the wall of the cave. "This is the weapon we're going to use to defeat the Cyclops," he said, and as he explained his plan to his companions, he used his sword to cut a long piece off the pole. He sharpened it to a point and held the sharpened end into the fire to harden it. Then he hid the finished weapon at the back of the cave, ready for when the Cyclops returned. It was evening before he heard the terrible feet coming back. Thud, thud, thud. The stone was dragged away from the mouth of the cave and in came the sheep. The Cyclops lumbered after them, pulling the stone into place behind him. The evening went the same way as the one before. The Cyclops milked a sheep, swilled down 2 buckets full of milk, then grabbed 2 sailors for his supper, crunching their bones as he chewed them up. It was a horrific sight, but Odysseus and the rest of his companions forced themselves to stay quiet. Soon they would have their revenge. When the Cyclops had finished eating, he settled himself down beside the fire, and that was the moment Odysseus had been waiting for. Filling a drinking bowl with strong wine he brought from the ship, he stepped forward and held it up to the Cyclops. I brought this as a gift, he said, hoping for your help, but I can see that you're too wild and savage to appreciate good wine. The Cyclops snatched the bowl out of his hand and drank the wine in a single gulp, and then he rolled his single glaring eyes and held out the bowl. More, he growled. And when you've poured it, tell me your name. I have a gift for you, too. Odysseus smiled and said, but he didn't. He smiled, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He just filled the bowl again, and then again after that, and again. And the Cyclops went on guzzling the wine, not realizing how strong it was. And gradually his speech slurred, and his eye glazed over. When he was totally drunk, Odysseus spoke at last. You asked for my name, he said. I'll tell you, I'm called Nobody. Now, where's the gift you promised me? And the Cyclops rolled his eye and bellowed with laughter. Look at him. Here it is. I promised to eat all of your companions before I eat you. Isn't that a fine gift? I'll save you until last. He roared with laughter again and then slumped over onto his back. In less than a minute, he was snoring drunkenly. And as soon as he was unconscious, Odysseus ran to the back of the cave to fetch the pole he had sharpened. And once again, he and his men plunged it into the fire, but this time they held it there until it was red hot. And when he was just about to burst into flames, they lifted it out and raised it high in the air, and then they drove it with all of their strength into the Cyclops' one enormous eye. He awoke with a scream, knocking them out of the way as he jumped to his feet, and he went on screaming as he struggled to pull the stake out of his eye. The noise awoke every other Cyclops on the hillside, and they all came racing down from their homes, shaking the ground like an earthquake. What's the matter, Polyphemus? They yelled. Why are you shouting like that? Who's in the cave with you? Nobody, Polyphemus shouted. Nobody's here. The other giants were baffled. Has someone hurt you? They yelled. Do you want revenge? Nobody has hurt me, Polyphemus bellowed. I want revenge on nobody. Then why are you making such a fuss? The others shouted angrily. Be quiet and let us get sleep. They stomped their way up the hill, leaving Polyphemus blundering around in the cave in agony. The worse the pain grew, the more he wanted revenge. And when morning came, he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the cave and let the sheep out to go to pasture, but he was determined not to let his enemies escape. Sitting down in the entrance, he stretched out his great arms, running them over the ground to make sure that only sheep got past him. Oh, they're not pretty. The sailors looked desperately at one another. What could they do now? If they tried to sneak out with the sheep, they were sure they'd be caught. But Odysseus had thought of that and made another plan. And while it was still dark, he tied the Cyclops' great sheep together in threes, knotting twillo wigs into their thick curly wool. Now, without making a sound, he showed his men in sign language how to cling to the underneath of the middle sheep. Once they were up, he tied them securely into place. As soon as he let the sheep go, they trotted towards the mouth of the cave, and Polyphemus ran his hand over the backs of and around their feet, searching for the sailors, but the men were hidden in the thick wool, protected by sheep on each side, and he didn't find them. One by one, they were carried out of the cave until only Odysseus was left. All the sheep had gone now except the big ram that held the flock. Jumping underneath it, Odysseus clung to its fleece, twisted his arms and legs into the wool, and the animal trotted towards Polyphemus. Oh, my ram, Polyphemus said, and he felt its horns. Why are you last instead of leading the way? What's the matter with you? He kept the ram in front of him, running his hands over it. And this is how they got out. Underneath, Odysseus held his breath as the thick fingers came towards him. They were just about to touch his shoulder when Polyphemus let out a great sigh. You stayed behind because you're sad, didn't you, dear ram? He said, you know I've been hurt. If I could find nobody, that treacherous weakling, I would beat his brains out. Oh, if only you could tell me where he is. For a second he paused, almost as though he expected the ram to speak. Then he let it go, and it trotted out of the cave, and Odysseus loosened his cramped hands and jumped down quickly and untied his men, and they all raced toward the ship, herding the fat sheep with them. It would have been perfect escape if only Odysseus had kept his mouth shut. But he didn't. As the ship left the shore, he ran to the stern and he yelled triumphantly at Polyphemus, "So, I'm a treacherous weakling, am I, Cyclops? Well, this weakling has defeated you and given you the punishment you deserve." The Cyclops heard his voice and charged toward the sea with a roar, heaving a great rock out at the ground, and he flung it into the sea, aiming towards the sound. The splash of sent the ship rocking, and the sailors pleaded with Odysseus to be quiet, but he wouldn't stop shouting. "Do you want to know who was clever enough to trick you?" he yelled at Polyphemus. "Well, you can tell your friends it wasn't nobody. It was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca." The Cyclops bellowed and lifted his massive hands, calling out to the god Poseidon, who was his father. "Father Poseidon, grant me revenge. Stop Odysseus from reaching his home in Ithaca. Or if he must reach home, let it be only after a long journey. Let him lose all of his companions and his ships and arrive in Ithaca like a wretch, to find his home full of trouble." The sea swelled and thundered, boiling around Odysseus' ship. His men pulled at their oars, desperate to return to the island where they had left their comrades and the other 11 ships. They were terrified of being wrecked before they could reach it, but by morning they were there and everything was calm. The sea slapped softly on the beach under the clear sky, and it seemed that Polyphemus's curse had dissolved like a puff of wind. But it hadn't. Deep under the river of ocean, Poseidon the earth shaker had heard the voice of his son. Rearing up his mighty head, he scanned the wine-dark sea until he found Odysseus and his tiny fleet of 12 long ships. Shaking tangled locks of his hair, Poseidon began to watch them. Look at this. This is Poseidon shaking the tangled locks of his hair. He is watching as Odysseus is trying to get back to Ithaca. And that is where we end today.